Northern Italy is perhaps one of the most beautiful places in the world. The rolling green hills, the stunning snow-capped Alps, the romantic architecture, and the weathered facades make for the perfect setting for two of Italy's most famous cities, Venice and Florence. Both of the famous and storied northern Italian cities are densely packed with distinctive cultures, architectures, and cityscapes. Now, here on A Sense of Travel, my goal is to capture all 5 senses of as many cities, countries, and natural wonders around the world as I can, so that I can accurately immerse you into the physical experiences of those places through the screen. That said, today, I'm diving into more than just the things you can experience through photography and through bullet lists. How do Venice and Florence stack up in the way that they smell, the way the air feels, the ambience and the lore that creates the magic of the atmosphere, the sounds that fill your ears in the city streets, and, of course, the tastes that define each experience? Find out today in the 3rd installment of Comparing the Senses, Venice versus Florence. After the video, be sure to comment on which of these 2 cities you find has an experience that fits your persona more. I'm Michael, and this is A Sense of Travel. Let's dive in. So, before we take on the senses, let's take a look at some very quick facts about each city in case you aren't familiar with either one. Venice isn't just the famous canal-ridden island that you might be familiar with, although that's where we're landing today. Nearly 260,000 people call the city of Venice home, and there are over 4.8 million people in the Veneto region of Italy. Comparatively, Florence holds a similar 360,000 people, with around 3.7 million in Tuscany as a whole. Venice is the further north of the 2 Italian cities, perched on the edge of the Adriatic Sea, and, in the historic island's case, on the sea itself. Florence, on the other hand, sits further south and on the opposite coast of the country, though not quite at the sea. Instead, this art museum of a city is tucked into the rolling hillsides and vineyards of Tuscany. So the first thing to look at when stacking up Venice and Florence is perhaps the most obvious: their historic, picturesque cityscapes. So normally I'd look at both of the overall cityscapes and then their old towns separately, but in this case the 2 are virtually interchangeable. So let's kick off in Venice. Venice is a city that's very much influenced by the water, and its cityscape really reflects that. On the historic Venetian island, there are no roads. Instead, there are hundreds of canals, both wide and gaping, and both narrow and winding. The strikingly aqua-blue water drifting into the canals splashes slowly against the old brick and the plaster buildings, which are facaded with pink, orange, beige, and white, some of which are weathered away to expose the brick or stone beneath, and many of which have balconies adorned in greenery or laundry hung out to dry. Arched bridges, both small and large, cross over the canals. There are no modern 20th or 21st century buildings on the historic city center islands. None. Everything from the buildings to the bridges to the tiled piazzas is weathered, aged, and waterlogged, except for the well-kept and protected magnificent domed cathedrals. That said, though this may seem obvious, the city is entirely low-rise, with a few exceptions. Above the roofline of clay terracotta roofs, Venice's lagoon islands are dotted with aged bronze domes of magnificent basilicas, old brick bell towers, and the San Marco Tower, dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. The city is a literal maze. When you aren't wandering alongside a canal wedged in between ancient, weathered buildings, you find yourself in narrow, dim pathways abundant with small nooks and crannies. It's an In Bruges reference if you're a fan. That the locals can find their way around without getting completely lost every day is truly a mystery to me. Venetian architecture rests heavily in the Gothic and Renaissance realms, with decorative archways in a serpentine shape, these are OG arches, and intricately detailed stonework alongside a style called Rococo, which involves often over-the-top ornamentals. The splashing aqua-blue waves of the Adriatic Sea that surround the lagoon of an island, along with the countless boats, gondolas, and bridges, create a uniquely nautical atmosphere. While both Venice and Florence sit in the northern half of Italy, that doesn't mean that they look like one and the same. The cityscape of Florence, in fact, can feel night and day compared to the canal-ridden heart of Venice. Comparatively, Florence is an opportunity to kind of spread your arms out. Florence has no bad angles. As if you were transported into an oil painting of a quintessential Mediterranean old town itself, Florence's tightly packed, narrow, cobbled streets, enclosed by medieval mid-rise buildings painted in a creamy yellow and adorned by deep green and red shutters and wrought iron balconies, feels like a different world, particularly from an American perspective. Occasionally, you'll stumble across a gray stone structure that really reeks of historical importance and significance and seems as if it's existed forever. Adorning many of the door frames and alleys are Italian flags, which are flown frequently, proudly, and prominently. Cascading right through the heart of Florence is the wide, murky, greenish-brown Arno River, a notable shift from Venice's aqua canals. From the stone-cobbled promenade along the river's edge, you'll notice tall, pointy brick bell towers, alongside which are terracotta-tiled basilica domes, massive and commanding, above a larger sea of terracotta lining the mid-rise buildings that blanket the city. The central arcades of Florence are a bit more spacious than the narrower streets in the neighborhoods, and by far more spacious than Venice, and seem a bit more polished and clean. These pedestrian-oriented boulevards carry higher-end shopping, nearly omnipresent gelato shops, restaurants, cafes, and boutiques on the ground level, with multiple stories of apartments and condos above. From atop Piazza del Michelangelo, the vistas over the city, the Arno River, and the rolling mountains and hillsides on the horizon are simply blissful. From the Plateau Piazza, the prominent bell towers and terracotta-clotted domes dominate the skyline. The towering, greenish-blue hills in the foreground are covered in classic Mediterranean villas, and the rolling mountains in the distance appear blue and misty. Unlike the cathedrals and basilicas of Northern Europe, the churches in Florence aren't just intricately carved stone. Shades of blue, gold, and pink layered into the marble and tile accents make for a very interesting and just visually stimulating cathedral entrance and help showcase the ways in which Florentine architecture really contributes to that sensation of the city being a living art gallery. The city's overall color palettes differ just a little bit in regard to their overall cityscape, as indicated here. When you see a picture or a video of a place and you try to imagine what it must feel like to actually be there, an important component of that is the way the air smells. Let's see how Venice and Florence stack up. Venice's scentscape can honestly be summarized in one word: waterlogged. Especially as you wonder about the canals, fishy marine water fills your nostrils. As you peruse the outer edges of the historic island, salty air surrounds you thanks to the salt water of the Adriatic Sea. It isn't just water that creates that waterlogged scent in Venice. The weathered and aged buildings that densely blanket the city have been worn and dampened over the ages by the sea breeze, leading to that musty, damp smell in the stone and brick. Throughout the day, those fishy, wet stone-scented alleyways and canals begin to fill with the smells of freshly baked bread, sweet pastries, and homemade pasta. All things considered, if I were to create a Venice-scented candle, it would smell of sea breeze, marine water, baking bread, stone, and pasta noodles. By comparison, Florence doesn't really have a strong scent palette, and depending on who you ask, that might be a good or a bad thing. Given its location in the rolling hills of Tuscany, the marine scents of Venice are replaced with dewy mountainsides and murky water from the Arno. Florence, although not as densely packed as Venice, is still a tight city with mid-rise stone and plaster buildings everywhere to be found, permeating their scents into the air. Restaurants, likewise, are on seemingly every corner, and wafts of freshly made pasta will catch your nose here too as you wander the streets. If I were to create a Florence scented candle, it would contain notes of musty stone, river water, morning dew, damp earth, and fresh pasta. To add to the overall scent and vibe of the city, I might add a note of Tuscan red wine. The taste of Italy is world-renowned and famous, and yet, it's still remarkably diverse by the region. In both Venice and Florence, Italian culinary staples have come to be, and each city has a unique taste to add to the menu. To compare the tastes of both cities, let's start in Venice. Given its seaside location, Venice's culinary scene is definitely influenced by the sea, but it still has a few Venetian surprises up its sleeve. Here are a few of the city-defining dishes. Bigoli in salsa. Bigoli in salsa is an absolute must-try and Venetian staple. I stumbled upon Osteria al Bortego deep into the mix-matched patchwork that is Venice, and I'm so glad I did. In the style of a traditional taverna, Al Protego serves up Italian pub fare relatively cheaply, and the bigoli and salsa was only 14 euros. The bigoli noodles were thick cut and dense, and the hot sardine spread on top was thick, chunky, and fishy. Tramazzini. Bar alla Toletta is known to tourists and locals alike as one of the best spots to grab a Venetian staple called tramazzini. These snack-sized sandwiches are filled with an assortment of delicious spreads, and the ones I tried ranged from quite traditional to a bit niche. The flavors are rich and pop with each chew, which is something I've found to be consistent with all of the Italian cuisine I've had. Zaletti. There are too many Venetian dessert creations to count, and certainly too many to try in one day, but at a place called Rosa Salva, the baker informed me that Zaletti was about as Venetian as it gets. Zaletti is a dense shortbread that seems to have raisins baked inside and is covered in powdered sugar. At least at Rosa Salva, the cookies are large and long. I ate two, alongside an Americano. Now, the Tuscany region of Italy may be known primarily for its wine, but the food in Florence is really just as fantastic, and quite different than the Venetian staples. Here are just a few of the dishes I tried that I think capture Florence's culinary identity pretty strongly. Florentine beefsteak. At Trattoria dell'Oste near the central train station sits one of the best steaks I've ever tasted. The number of times the word wow went through my head while chewing into this true delicacy really gives me an uncanny likeness to Owen Wilson. The Scotana steak from Trattoria dell'Oste was excellently salted, perfectly cooked, tender, huge, and incredibly juicy. Gelato. There's actually a pretty big debate that suggests that gelato was created right here in Florence. There are gelato shops on nearly every corner throughout the city, and each with soft, creamy, rich flavors, either made from scratch or imported from within Italy. Some of my favorite flavors included tiramisu and chocolate cappuccino. Gnocchi. One of my best friends who studied in Florence for a semester in college assured me that gnocchi was a can't miss of the city, and he was pretty spot on in this assessment. Gnocchi is so good. Warm, squishy, creamy potato dumplings in a rich cheese sauce and dusted in Parmesan, my dish came from Pensavo Peggio alongside freshly baked bread and a rustic atmosphere. As you can see, there's really no clear winner on the tastes here, and it's entirely subjective. This is also not even close to a comprehensive list of the defining tastes of each city. Venice is an incredibly refreshing city, especially from an American perspective, because guess what sounds you won't hear on the historic island? Cars. Instead, motorboats trudge through the cloudy, aquamarine water, which creates the additional soundscape of clapping lagoon waves into the seawalls. Seagulls cry into the chilly sea air, which is filled with the sounds of trotting tourists on the old tile and cobbled stone. During the Venetian evening, you'll hear modern dance club tunes bumping from the shops and the nightclubs, juxtaposed with street musicians strumming classic Italian chords on the guitar. Florence, in contrast, is a bit louder. There aren't as many cars on the streets here as in the US, but those that are create a far louder sound thanks to the echo of the cobbled stones and the narrow passages. The same effect happens with sirens. The soundscape is also filled with the sounds of motorbike engines. There are more here in Florence than anywhere else I've ever been. On a softer note, you'll find in Florence that church bells chime on the hour and the clatter of cutlery permeates the outdoor dining patios where Italian-speaking locals dine. I should note that my experience in both Venice and Florence happened in the wintertime. On a winter's morning in Venice, it's cold. Like, really cold. The water from the sea and the humidity it creates makes it feel much colder. By midday, however, it's still chilly, but the air feels far more comfortable. Fortunately, a lack of high-rise buildings allows for more sunlight. Florence, in contrast, is less humid thanks to its location in the rolling Tuscan hills and the soft blue mountains. It's certainly still chilly here in the wintertime, but less so. In part, I suppose, thanks to its location further south and its more sheltered environment. If Venice and Florence are anything like Rome, which I have been to in the summertime, then they get far warmer than you would expect. So what do I mean when I talk about the comparison of the ambience and the lore of each city? For starters, I'm a strong proponent of the idea that to really capture the spirit and the magic of places around the world, you have to let your imagination run wild a little bit. After all, urban legends, mythological fairy tales, and dramatized history are a big part of the identity of cities and countries worldwide. Letting fantasy and folklore infiltrate your mind as you wander about can really bring out the mystique and the charm in different places. Venice feels like a fairy tale fishing town with a touch of Roman mythology and an overall aura of mystery. As you wander through the absolute maze of alleyways and pedestrian streets in the dense historic island, you can't help but feel as if you've been whisked away into a world where everyone around you is a part of a fantastic and rather eclectic mythological adventure. I don't know, maybe it's the men rowing through the canals on their gondolas, or the spine-chilling stories of the waterlogged houses deep into the maze, or the dark legends at the Bridge of Sighs, or the imposing and weathered statues of old Roman legends, or the colorful and astrological murals embedded into the architecture. But Venice is the perfect setting for almost any type of magical story. There's also a bit of an Atlantis feeling in Venice. As you may know, the city is slowly sinking into the sea thanks to climate change in part, but also because its foundations of wood are literally sinking into the sand of the seafloor. Now, Florence feels a bit more grounded in reality than Venice, but that's not exactly a bad thing. Florence is probably the most romantic city I've ever visited. There's a true sense of sheer romance and art to every street, every cathedral, and every facade in this beautiful Tuscan town. Mesmerizing art is the heartbeat of this city. The Uffizi galleries, overlooking the wide Arno River, are home to some of the world's most famous Renaissance pieces. Now, speaking of the Renaissance, Florence is the birthplace of this enlightening era in human history. That's not something you'll easily forget as you wander its streets. Nearby, Michelangelo's David statue towers over the rest of the Gallery dell'Accademia. This oil canvas of a city doesn't just express its historic artistic prowess through its sculptures and through its paintings, however. Florence Cathedral, for example, is a genuine work of art and proof that architecture can and should be a visual representation and expression of a place's soul. Florence is a place that, surrounded by its beautiful and hazy blue mountains, feels as if a Shakespeare romance is just on the edge of kicking off. The idea here isn't to pit cities up against each other. In fact, the idea is to celebrate the fact that there's so much world to discover, experience, and explore, even within the same countries. Thanks for diving into the northern Italian cities of Venice and Florence with me today, and stay tuned for more city comparisons in the near future. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.